Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Lyric Digital Stage Write Out Loud number 4 of the 2021-2022 season. Tonight, we have a very special presentation by some Saskatchewan writers, this wonderful book, an anthology called Apart. It is a year of pandemic, poetry, and prose. And tonight, we're going to hear from 4 of the authors who have their works included in this wonderful book. But first, I want to remind us that we stand on traditional Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we are committed to move forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We also stand in solidarity with all people who stand in opposition to oppression, lack of freedom of expression, and the violent suppression of free speech and basic human rights. We stand with members of the Black community, people of color, Indigenous peoples, 2S LGBTQ communities, people with disabilities, and all who experience oppressive marginalization and systemic racism and violence, including those acts that occur of that nature in our own country. Apart was published by the Saskatchewan Writers Guild in July of this year. Both award-winning and first-time writers contributed 74 pieces, including poems, short stories, essays, and a scene from a play. Editor Dave Margoshes calls the collection a scrapbook of life in the pandemic and a testament to human experience during a very difficult period. Co-editor Courtney Bates Hardy says, "A thread of hope and resilience is woven throughout." Our Southwest Saskatchewan readers tonight are Madonna Hamel, Caitlin McCollum Arnell, Helen Moore, and Peggy Worrell. These 4 writers applied for and received a $1,000 grant from the Saskatchewan Arts Board for this evening, plus another event at the East End Library on November 4th. One of the reasons they qualified was because Southwest Saskatchewan is considered to be an underserved part of the province when it comes to arts funding. Thank you to Sask Arts. Our first writer this evening is Helen Moore. Helen lives and writes in Rosetown, Saskatchewan. She's the author of 3 collections of short fiction, Landlocked, What's Come Over Her, and To Everything a Season. 2 of these titles have been finalists in the Sask Book Awards. The prairie landscape and its people continue to inspire her writing. She is a fast walker, an enthusiastic musician, and a passionate gardener in all 4 seasons. Helen will be reading One Afternoon in the Winter of Our Discontent from the anthology, as well as an excerpt from an essay entitled On the Wild Side. Thank you, Helen.
Everyone, my name is Helen Moore. Thanks for joining us for the Write Out Loud launch of Apart, the SWG Pandemic Anthology. And a special thanks to Gordon McCall for coordinating the reading tonight. I'm going to be reading my short story, One Afternoon in the Winter of Our Discontent. As with most of my stories, it is autobiographical, but veers into fiction in order for the story to work. So I will begin. Annabelle looked out her kitchen window at the snow-blasted houses on George Street, the result of a ferocious wind 2 days ago which rampaged throughout the late afternoon, evening, and into the night, leaving little spikes of pain pulsing in her forehead and eyes. No, she reasoned, it's not COVID. The far more likely diagnosis, anxiety. The power had been off all night, and the house was just now beginning to warm. It was all too much, the pandemic, the surging case numbers, and then, to top it off, a biblical storm. She'd found the only cure, walking several kilometers a day, no matter the weather. Now her body and her brain and her psyche craved the ritual like an addict. It was a harmless addiction, low cost, no nasty side effects, respectable. "I'm going walking, hun," she yelled down to David in the rec room where he was poring over another jigsaw puzzle, his addiction of choice. Annabelle thought perhaps he needed therapy. He'd been stuck on this puzzle for weeks now, with a couple of dozen pieces left orphaned. It seemed to him that the pieces were all the same, and they would kind of fit, but not really. And then he was off on another hunting expedition. Annabelle was no help, as she disliked making puzzles and had no talent for it whatsoever. She set off up the snow-clad street, her studded winter boots grabbing the icy patches, her arms swinging in a pleasant rhythm, legs stretching out, the pain behind her eyes gradually receding. She maneuvered around fallen tree branches and toppled recycling bins all the way up George Street, past Walter Elementary, where Elliot, her youngest grandson, was in grade 6. They'd been back in school now for 7 days after closing down for 2 weeks before Christmas because of a COVID outbreak. She loved hearing the sounds of the children at recess, so bright and innocent and happy. It almost didn't ring true, as if this were a scene from another time, long ago. At the end of the alley, she cut across Jubilee Crescent and turned onto the Rose Trail, a walking path on the north edge of town, with a double row of ash and elm bordered by a ubiquitous caragana hedge and punctuated with red metal benches. She'd never seen anyone sitting on the benches, but the sight of them made her think that someone might. It was here, on the trail, that the full impact of the storm struck her. The snow had been blown into magnificent dunes, the swooping lines of a master sculptor, while the west side of the trees were covered in long white columns, which seemed to be cut with a knife at even intervals. "Maybe I'm crazy, but I think this is beautiful," thought Annabelle. She wished she had brought her camera, but then reminded herself to just enjoy the moment for what it was. It was easier to walk in the alley, as the trail was completely blown in and transformed. She slowed, letting unexpected beauty penetrate her soul. Then, at the very edge of her line of vision, she saw them. 4 mule deer, spaced 2 meters apart. They must have gotten the memo. Scavenging for whatever had not been plundered by the storm. It was pretty poor pickings. As she drew closer, the 2 smaller deer, they could have been twins, as well as the buck and the doe, stopped and stared at her as if she was the intruder. Annabelle had never been this close to a wild animal before, had never seen such beautiful eyes, large brown luminescent pools where the mystery of their existence floated. Their absolute stillness was transcendental. The birds that had been gossiping a few moments before quieted. The traffic noise on Marshall Road drifted away. In this pocket of silence, Annabelle felt a tingle of alarm, as if she had been told, "Message coming in, pay attention." They stared at each other, the woman and the deer, and it was Annabelle who had to look away. She turned and continued up the alley, gazing back at the deer who now and again glanced her way, but mostly they went back to foraging. They were so patient and willing to stay there and live out the situation to the fullest until something was revealed to them. The rest of the way home, Annabelle tried to make sense of it. She wanted so badly to believe it meant something. The storm, the transfigured landscape, the pandemic, the deer as they laid claim to her walking trail, the children in the schoolyard, they were all strands from the skein of events in this strange winter. Maybe she would never untangle it, but if she did, It might transform itself into something new and beautiful. Already at 4:30 in the afternoon, the sun had lost its power and was dropping to the horizon. She could barely see it now, hidden behind the towering new house on the corner of her block. Her headache gone, anxiety suppressed, the ache in her soul still there, but lightened somehow. She'd go back home and make a cup of tea for her and David, perhaps help him find another piece to the puzzle. So, a question you might have concerning the story that I just read is, why didn't I just make it a nonfiction piece? Well, I tried writing it in first person and, I couldn't make it work. So I needed some distance from the event that fiction provides and the freedom to change certain details. So I hope that kind of explains the process a bit. So now I'm going to share with you some excerpts from another piece of writing that further explores my connection to nature. Now this piece of writing is nonfiction, and it's told in first person. So you will kind of see how the two different genres work. So this is called On the Wild Side. A few summers ago, I found myself swimming solo in Waskesiu Lake. It was mid-morning, and I, my sister and brother-in-law had decided to head to the beach early and stake out a claim. We were staying far enough away from the busy resort town of Waskesiu to feel as if we might have a wilderness experience. Capassowin Bungalows is the name of the quaint little cluster of cabins we have often stayed at over the years. There are enough conveniences to make life pleasant, such as running water and flush toilets, but not so many amenities it feels like home. The beach was a short walk over rough sand and surprising obstacles of deadfall. We persevered and emerged onto a small apron of beach backed by dark spruce and bright green birch. There was not a soul in sight or a single boat on the water. We spread out our towels, applied sunscreen, and leaned back to soak up the rays. I couldn't figure out why it was so quiet that morning. Where was everyone? The northern fires had been burning for most of June and July, but had subsided enough that tourists were trickling back. Still, lots of people had been scared away by the hysterical media. Okay, I asked myself, when will you get another chance to swim all by yourself in Waskesiu Lake? Keep an eye on me, Cheryl and Al, I said. I'm going in. They barely looked up from their books. Neither one of them can swim. I didn't exactly run into the lake, but I very purposefully strode through the water until I was submerged up to my armpits. Then I gathered my courage and dived under. You might say it was cold turkey. After the initial shock and a few strokes to get my body acclimatized, I felt exhilarated, as if all my nerve endings had suddenly woken up and were on high alert. I turned on my back and floated. It was just me and the blue shimmer of the lake, the enormous bowl of the sky, and beyond that, the cool, dark woods. I felt this experience, for which there really are no adequate words, was trying to impart to me some profundity, some awareness that the world was alive and sentient, but ultimately mysterious. Because so many of us in Saskatchewan live in rural areas, it is not unusual to have a quasi-wilderness experience. On the land we farm, a pretty little ravine cuts through several quarters. Even though it is bordered by a busy highway and a decommissioned railway, my husband and son are regularly surprised and delighted by the wildlife visitations, herds of deer and antelope, coyotes, the occasional moose. Just last week, a black bear somehow wandered down from the north and was spotted enjoying a pit stop in a culvert. My husband will often stop the tractor and air seeder and move a nest of birds to the side rather than run over them. He will even set out water for the moose, who wanders occasionally into the farmyard to pillage the garden. The poet Linda Monahan, who lives on the edge of the Nesbitt Forest, uses the natural world, her own wilderness, if you will, to merge with her inner self. In her latest book, Verge, a fox lopes through the poem, looking back on the cold yesterday of childhood, and then travels with her through adulthood as she experiences pain and loss, finally crossing the river with her to a place of peace. The writer Marilyn Robinson, author of the trilogy Gilead, Home, and Lila, talks about growing up in a small Iowa town surrounded by a great wilderness. As a young girl, she spent much of her time exploring the woods around her grandparents' ranch, sensing a divine presence there, and having that presence return some kind of response. That communion with the landscape is apparent in all her writing. As a child, I spent hours in the wooded area behind our farmhouse, talking to the trees, communing with birds, and I imagined a presence there. Even then, like my friend and poet Linda, I sensed that the trees knew something that I didn't. My brother, who lives in central Alberta in the midst of a beautiful old-growth forest, knows this as well. One day I teasingly asked him when he was coming back to church, a place he turned his back on decades ago. He replied, "If I want to have a conversation with God, I go for a walk in the woods." Fair enough. There are some wilderness adventures in Saskatchewan I'd still like to take on. Canoeing up the Churchill River, I've probably waited too long for that one. A trek through the Grasslands Provincial Park. One more camping trip with the grandchildren up north. Waking up to that unforgettable smell of the lake and the forest after a midnight rain shower. Knowing you are in the middle of nowhere, but oh my God, are you ever somewhere amazing? Thank you so much for listening.
Our next writer is Peggy Worrell. Peggy grew up on a farm near Yorkton. Peggy is a social worker as well as a writer. Her collection of short fiction, Proud Flesh, was a finalist for 2 Sask Book Awards. Other stories have been published in anthologies and literary journals. Currently, she's working on a novel and a nonfiction manuscript. Peggy lives in Swift Current with her husband, James. She loves her family even more than she loves words. She will be reading part 1 of a 2-part creative nonfiction story based on the lives of her grandparents in Ryan, Saskatchewan. It's called On the Eve of Halloween. Thank you, Peggy.
Good evening. My name is Peggy Worrell, and I would like to thank the Saskatchewan Writers Guild for publishing this pandemic anthology entitled Apart. And I'd also like to thank the Saskatchewan Arts Board and the Lyric Theatre for making this evening possible. I will be reading an excerpt from a 2-part story entitled On the Eve of Halloween. On a homestead at Rhine, Saskatchewan, Elizabeth and her husband Heinrich grew grain and vegetables and raised cattle, pigs, and chickens to feed their 6 children. They drew water from a well, cooked on a wood stove, heated with furnace oil, washed clothes on a washboard, used an outhouse, and owned a team of horses to pull a plow, buggy, and sleigh. Their day-to-day lives were much the same as those of other German immigrants, who had arrived on the prairies from Russia at the turn of the 20th century and were spared the Bolshevik massacre. Although women had earned the right to vote in 1916, neither Elizabeth nor Heinrich voted in the 1917 election because they could not read or write English. By then, the population of Saskatchewan had grown to 700,000 due to immigration from Germany, the USA, and the Scandinavian countries. News of influenza reached Rhine in 1918, causing them to worry about their youngest daughter, Lillian's barking cough. They took her the 36 miles to Yorkton to see a doctor. He prescribed medicine for croup and explained how to make a croupette. Before leaving Yorkton, Heinrich bought the October 1st edition of the Regina Leader. He could make sense of the word flu in the headline. Heinrich constructed a dome-shaped frame over Lillian's bed and covered it with canvas. Elizabeth set a pot of boiling water on the floor for the steam to rise into an opening in the tent. Heinrich took the newspaper to the Justice of the Peace in Rhine. He read aloud, "Dr. Seymour, Provincial Health Commissioner, will search a train bound from Eastern Canada for signs of the Spanish influenza amongst the passengers. Preventative measures include isolation and the wearing of masks." Lillian's cough improved, and she no longer gasped for breath, but the medicine ran out and she was still unwell. The doctor in Yorkton gave them a different concoction on their second visit and advised them to keep brandy on hand in case either of them caught the Spanish flu. Heinrich picked up the October 15th edition of the Regina Leader. Back in Rhine, the JP read, "Dr. Seymour is asking any nurses or physicians available to help with the epidemic to report to his office. To avoid getting the flu, he suggests to avoid crowds, not to sneeze or cough close to another person, and not to use sprays or gargles unless suggested by a physician. The hospitals, including the isolation hospital, are all full with cases of the Spanish flu. Many medical professionals are ill. The situation at the Royal Northwest Mounted Police Barracks has improved, with only one death and no other severe cases in the last 3 days." Lillian recovered fully, but Heinrich and 2 of their other children became ill. A midwife came to the house wearing a mask and confirmed their fear that it was the Spanish flu. She told about children who had died and the neighbor who had fallen dead on his way from the barn to the house. "There are no funerals," she said, "only burials." Hospitals in Yorkton and Regina were full, and a home had opened in Moose Jaw to care for children whose parents were too ill to look after them. She warned them to stay out of other people's houses because the disease was extremely contagious. Heinrich was confined to bed, coughing day and night. Elizabeth steamed him with eucalyptus oil, applied putrid mustard plasters to his chest, and spooned Bishop's blackberry brandy into his dry, cracked lips. 10-year-old Henry took over feeding and watering the farm animals. With instructions from his father, he put up a croupiette over his sick brother and sister's bed. They had no way of knowing about the shortage of wooden coffins, or that churches, cafes, and pool halls in Regina had been closed, or that gatherings of more than 25 people were prohibited with the threat of $50 fines. In answer to Elizabeth's prayers, or so she believed, her husband and children survived. But Henry remained frail. His lungs had been weakened, he tired easily, and he was unable to do any physical labor. He rented out their land to a man named George the following spring and made plans for a house to be built in the village of Rhine. His intention was to give up farming, move his family to the village, and live off income from rent and the livestock. At the end of July 1919, Heinrich went in to check on the progress of the house. He took Lillian along. He came home with an inexpensive necklace for Elizabeth's birthday, treats for each of the children, and a newspaper. When he kissed Elizabeth and gave her the present, she scolded him for wasting money. Young Henry read the July 23rd Regina Morning Leader to his parents, mistaking some words and skipping over others. He began with news about the Spanish flu, then weather, then an article about a by-election in nearby Pelly. Sarah Ramsland is making a strong run in Pelly, canvassing for votes to succeed her husband Magnus, who died last year of influenza. Accompanied by a woman friend, the two drove their own car. It's a rough country with many bad roads, and the making of the trip successfully has proved to people that a woman can get around and represent them, even under difficulties. Liberal Premier William Melville Martin was quoted, saying this would give the widow an income for her and her children. They later learned that Sarah Ramsland had indeed been elected as the first woman ever in the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan. Heinrich's cough worsened, and at times he couldn't catch his breath. By October, he was again bedridden. Elizabeth sat by his bed at night, praying. He instructed her to move into the new house when it was ready, if he didn't make it. She shushed him in a rough tone of voice and continued praying. On October 31st, young Henry was carrying a pail of milk from the barn to the house in the dark after milking cows. He stopped to watch a bat flying around the roof of the house again and again. He didn't know of the superstition that a bat encircling a house is a sign of an impending death. On the eve of Halloween in 1919, while pranksters were knocking over outhouses in Rhine, Heinrich died at the age of 34. Elizabeth fell forward. At first, she was silent, numb. Then she wailed, but not so loud as to wake the children. She wanted to be alone with her husband, to be intimate with him while his body was still warm. The patchwork quilt stifled her high-pitched keening and absorbed her tears. Eventually, her death wail collapsed into a moan, and she fell asleep face first on the mattress. The H1N1 virus, known as the Spanish flu, killed 5,000 people in Saskatchewan and 55,000 in Canada. Many young and hardy, like Heinrich. The major cause of the death was not the flu itself, but rather pneumonia in patients like him who had been weakened by the flu. Elizabeth was a 30-year-old widow with 6 children, ages 2 to 11. Why had God not answered her prayers?
Our next writer is Caitlin McCullum Arno. She grew up in Laurie, Ontario, but now lives in Ravenscrag with her husband and 9 rescue animals. In 2020, she was awarded the John V. Hicks Scholarship to attend Sage Hill Writing's fiction course. She draws inspiration from things that, as she says, piss her off and make her smile. She's been published in Transition. This is her first anthology. Caitlin will be reading an excerpt from Leonard Goes to Florida. Thank you, Caitlin.
Hello, welcome to Write Out Loud, and the second part of this is Southwest Saskatchewan book launch tour of Apart, a year of pandemic poetry and prose. Thank you to the Lyric Theatre, Sask Arts, and Saskatchewan Writers Guild for making this opportunity possible. I'm going to read from Apart and my short story called Leonard Goes to Florida. On a Monday, Leonard locked his front door and Dane and thought about putting a note in the mailbox for Marv the mailman. Nah, it'll be fine, Leonard said to the metal railing, heading down the steps. He would be back before anyone noticed he was gone. He didn't tell a soul where he was going, not even Eleanor, his daughter, and she was in Florida. She was a sports physical therapist for the Blue Jays. She had written to him in February to say they were still going to Dunedin for spring training, despite COVID. Every year she invited Leonard to come. It was an opportunity for him to meet the players. During the regular season, no special visits. Leonard always, never responded. An hour outside of Regina, Leonard got on the Trans-Canada Highway. At first, the drive was just like home, flat as a pancake. Then, outside of Winnipeg, the road opened up to 3 eastbound lanes. Traffic got heavier. Leonard felt like he might shit his pants. To calm himself, he repeated, anything east of Winnipeg exists because of the West. Anything east of Winnipeg exists because of the West. Don't you forget that, Leonard, his dad had always warned. I won't, said Leonard out loud to a small sports car whizzing by on his outside lane. Leonard's steering wheel sweated all through northern Ontario. Still, he preferred the threat of trees to traffic. At a gas station in Kapuskasing, a man said, bonjour. It sounded like a swear word to Leonard. His dad always said, only English, Leonard, that's all you got to speak, you hear? Something he failed to pass on to his daughter, Eleanor. She got an entrance scholarship to a bilingual university in Ottawa. Sheesh, his dad used to always say. When Leonard reached Toronto on Wednesday, his hips hurt from sleeping in the back seat of his truck. His blue eyes were coated insulation pink. Around supper time, the signs to Niagara Falls had reached 10 kilometers. Leonard took the exit for Lenora Street, happy to hear the hum of slow-moving vehicles again. Pulling into Lenora's driveway, Leonard saw her face through the paisley curtains of her bungalow's south-facing bay window. She was holding her phone. It was the first time seeing his cousin outside of Saskatchewan. He turned off his engine. Then he heard his phone ring. "Hey, you made it," Lenora said, waving out the window. "Of course I did," said Leonard into his phone. He waved back. "Got some bad news," said Lenora. "What's that?" Leonard asked and unclipped his seatbelt. "The roast beef's in the oven," said Lenora. That's all Leonard wanted to hear. "Leonard, you can't come in." "What?" The seatbelt crept up his plaid shirt. "The neighbors." She turned away from the window now. "And?" Leonard said. He stopped himself from opening the truck door. "You gots to go." "It's my Saskatchewan plates, ain't it?" asked Leonard. "I'll get a fine. Don't you see I called?" Went to voicemail. Lenora turned to face the glass again. She rubbed her left eye. "It's locked down. I can't." "You're going to leave me on the doorstep?" Leonard said. "Guess so." She began to tear up. Looking out his truck window, ignoring Lenora now, Leonard saw a woman coming towards him, walking a dog. His truck was blocking the sidewalk, so she had to go around. He didn't know if she smiled behind her mask, but she certainly didn't return Leonard's wave. "Unfriendly Eastern buggers," Leonard said. So I chose that section because I began writing as a mental health practice with the East End writers to deal with grief and isolation. I'm from Ontario, but my home is Southwest Saskatchewan now. Some of my family and friends are still in Ontario. I belong here, but sometimes it can be hard. This next section is dedicated to neighbor and local rancher Bill Armstrong. He, my husband, my father-in-law, and most of the local ranchers and farmers partially inspired the crafting of my main character, retired farmer-rancher Leonard. A week earlier, Leonard sat in a plush recliner at his house in Dane, a small town on the outskirts of ranch and farmland. The chair's mechanics buckled as he popped open the footrest. A coughing cordless phone rested on a floral TV dinner tray. "I ain't dying because of a dirty bird," said Leonard. "I'm better than that." Leonard had farmer's lung. His doctor said if he caught COVID, he would die. At first in his 40s, it was shortness of breath and cough whenever he cleaned a plug auger. But later in life, the symptoms came up with any kind of dust or wind. Leonard liked to think they moved to town because of Rita's health, but really it was the both of them. They rented out their land and sold off the equipment, except the Montgomery section, named after the family Leonard bought it from. Leonard would never get any money off that land again, not after his only child, Eleanor, sold it. "This nonsense government, I'm going to be dead by the time I see a damn needle," Leonard said out loud to his favorite Fox News anchor woman. "I got to do something," he said, this time to the glass covered above the TV. A university graduation picture of Eleanor sat between a plaque of the Lord's Prayer and Rita's Hummel dolls. The dolls' innocent eyes and cherub cheeks smiled at him. "Do it," they said. For my final section, I'll read part of my ending. You'll have to buy the book to find out what happens. I also wanted to say that endings can be very difficult to write. On Sunday morning, the day after he arrived, Leonard checked out of the motel in Tallahassee, Florida. He had on a dirty shirt and pants. He packed light, thinking Lenora would have done his laundry. His head hung low as he told the young woman at the desk, "I couldn't get the vaccine. Now I'm headed home." She took her hands off the keyboard of her computer. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir, but if it makes you feel any better, I still haven't gotten mine." "Now, do you want to use the credit card on file?" she asked. Yes'm," said Leonard. He looked around the motel lobby. It had been a trip of disappointment for him. No vaccine, no shell. He couldn't afford to stay any longer either. There was only so much overdraft his bank account could handle before he got a phone call. "Good thing you're setting out. If this weather keeps up, we'll be without power. Come to think of it, I better call my boyfriend to pick up batteries for our flashlights. Now you come back anytime, you hear?" "Sorry I can't offer you any coffee." She put up her hands in defeat. "COVID rules," she said. Outside, Leonard watched sleet pelt the palm trees next to the motel's outdoor pool. A group of giggling students raised the hoods of their spring jackets and snapped pictures of the weather as they too walked their vehicles. Leonard copied them and took out his phone. He didn't know where Dunedin was, but he knew it was in Florida. She picked up after the first ring. "Hey, Dad." He knew he had to do something. He wasn't going into the grave without trying. "Eleanor, why did you sell the land? Why aren't you married?" Thank you. Recently, I asked myself, what if the call for submissions for this anthology had come out this month? Would I have written something different? And the answer is yes. I wrote the first draft of this story after an online workshop on conflict and tension with Judy McCroskey through the Saskatchewan Writers Guild. The story literally flowed onto the page, something that rarely happens. At this point in the pandemic, much has opened up, and when I wrote Leonard Goes to Florida in January 2021, traveling and seeing family wasn't possible. At the time, I heard about people traveling despite the restrictions, so I think the act of writing allowed me to live vicariously through Leonard. I also want to say that the pandemic gave me time to write, and going online provided professional development opportunities that otherwise I wouldn't have had. All of a sudden, workshops typically held on a weekday evening in Regina and Saskatoon were accessible, as well as festivals from across the country. No plane tickets or hotel accommodations required. So thanks to everyone who supports writers, especially family and friends who are watching. And thank you to the editors, Apart editors, Courtney Bates-Hardy and Dave Margocious. Good night.
Our final writer tonight from Apart, this wonderful anthology about the pandemic, is Madonna Hamel. Madonna has lived all over Canada. She's worked as a writer, a broadcaster, a reporter, and a performer of her own one-woman shows and in a touring blues band. She lives in Val-Marie, Saskatchewan, where she's writing a novel based on the stories she's discovered collecting women's aprons in the area. She recently won first prize in Prairie Fire's Creative Nonfiction Contest for Hearth Day, a reflection on being encouraged to stay indoors on Earth Day. Tonight's reading, Essential Work, is a continuation of that theme. Thank you, Madonna.
Greetings, fellow lyric attenders in their jammies. I am here to read from part of the Apart anthology. I'm going to read a section from my piece called Essential Work by Madonna Hamel. I'm going to go right into the section about essential workers and homelessness. The year I graduated from art school, I got a job at a Vancouver gallery teaching street kids the art of performance. Me, teach them. They spend their days on sidewalks performing, pitching for spare change. But they talk fast, not used to having more than 4 seconds to get their story across, and I had to get them to slow down, expand their repertoire. They spoke in terse haikus that held long, full stories too. By the age of 18, most of them looked world-weary, like they held too much. We're giving you a night on stage, I reminded them. People are coming to hear you. So please speak slowly. I shared the old broadcasting rule of thumb. When it starts to sound too slow, that's when it's just right. On performance night, they were crackling with energy. Okay, I said to them backstage, just remember, people are sitting in chairs. People are paying to see you. They're not going anywhere. So milk it. And they did. But one 18-year-old named Juniper stands out. Her words worked their way into my thoughts, like a permanent sliver resurfacing every time I marvel at the ways that shameless greed gets framed as genius. Do morals even matter when fortune takes over? She asked. Standing in her long black raincoat and her straight black hair, she slayed us. She humbled us. And then, along with the others, she slipped back into the street. My initial excitement about being in Stegma's childhood home wears off by the 4th week of my residency. It gets replaced by an antsy, edgy darkness. I interpret that as a desire to surround myself with my own stuff because I need my own soul essentials, my books, my photographs, my little ritual objects, smudge sticks, votive candles, Mary statues, and animal bones. I need my plants that I rarely water and my guitar that I never play. I need my own home. On my birthday, my old school chum toasts me on this new thing called Zoom. She and her hubby are in their Toronto dining room. At one point, they step away from the screen to join a collective 7:30 p.m. cheer for essential workers. Off screen, while I sit staring at a potted plant in an empty room, people bang pots and dogs bark. Are you doing this where you are? My friend asks when she returns. It feels great. In a town of like 13, I say, the geese are louder. So, how are you coping? Oh, I'm fine. I'm still working. Movies have been declared an essential service. No kidding. I know, she says. It's stupid. In April, I'm staying up late, doom scrolling on my computer. I get hooked on late night talk shows. Initially, it's fascinating to watch celebrity guests at home with their kids and their spouses and their bookshelves. Lost without their studio lights, fanfare, and audience applause. They ease off on their showbiz shtick. In fact, I think they seem to forget they're talking to millions of us, not just Jimmy, and they whine about deprivations and inconveniences, redefine for the rest of us, the meaning of essential. They're stuck in their houses. No, not our LA place, our London place. They complain. They have to exercise in the basement, cook, vacuum, do laundry. They even have to dye their own hair from a box. At the end of the show, having saved so much by slumming it, they give extravagantly to their favorite charity. But rest assured, the next day, come lunchtime, they won't be hunting around in the back of the fridge for that half jar of peanut butter because of last night's generosity. I understand it's not the fault of the rich and famous that 550,000 Americans are homeless. It's not even their responsibility. But it's moments like these when the great Western chasm, the yawning trench between haves and have-nots, is fully revealed. The kings and queens of media, be they lefty actors or right-wing talk show hosts, or the op-ed anchors of misnamed news programs, compose, writes George Saunders in his essay, The Brain-Dead Megaphone, compose the de facto ruling class. He goes on to say, the conservative opinion king has more in common with the liberal opinion king than either does the liberal and conservative slaughterhouse workers in Wichita or Alberta. The opinion kings have friends in common, a similar ambition, a common frame of reference, shared agents, expected perks, a knowledge of the hierarchy of success indicators, a mastery of insider jargon. They go to the same cocktail parties. And I would add to that wardrobe, makeup, drivers, dressers, and of course, stylists to dye their hair. For 11 years, I worked at a radio station. 1 week in 2000, I kept pitching the same story every day. The roof of the Saint-Roch Mall in the city's first working-class district was about to be removed. The idea was to revive some of the ancien quartier's charm by exposing the old shops and paving stones. At the heart of it all stands Saint-Roch Church, the size of a cathedral, and built in the early 1600s. By removing the mall roof, the full glory of the church would be revealed, we were told. We should find out what's going to happen to the homeless who use the mall as a shelter when it's 40 below, I suggested. The homeless, I was told, are not our listening audience. No shit, I grumbled. What with them not having homes and all? I kept trying. I wondered aloud what would happen to the man in the wheelchair with the mangled leg, and the other guy with one arm and no teeth, and the kid with the emaciated dog. Eyes rolled. Here she goes again. In the end, we did a number of stories on economic stimulus for green spaces, tourists, and boutique hotels. We covered every angle of the story for our listening audience. But it is interesting to note that Saint-Roch, born in Montpellier in the Middle Ages, was a Franciscan monk who ministered to the sick and poor during the Black Death. It is said that anyone he prayed over was cured. Eventually, he succumbed to the plague himself. But before dying, he was rescued by a dog who found him languishing in the woods, his leg half gone due to a festering wound. Today, he is considered the patron saint against cholera, plague, skin rashes, contagious diseases, dogs, and invalids with bad legs. Thank you.